Well, hello. Welcome to God's Answers for Anxiety and Depression. I'm Pastor Ray Barnett. I want to wish you a good afternoon or a good morning or a good evening, depending on what time you're watching this video. As you can see, I'm in my car, and my intent was to take you on another nice field trip. A place that's on the Great Sacandaga Lake, which is again very close to my house, not across the street like the other places that I've been to so far and taken you to. It's a little further away, but not far at all. And by the time I reached the destination I had in mind, for once the weathermen were right. They said it was going to rain. It was beautiful sunny when I left. By the time I got to the destination, rain was coming down pretty hard. Stopped now, but it's still overcast. So, unfortunately, I'm on my way back home. I have Bible study tonight to do. And the more I come through some of these scenic areas, and not the ones even that were near my house, though some of you have expressed how you liked it. Well, let me say it this way. The Adirondack Mountains occupies 6 million acres in New York State. Very large. You could fit Yellowstone, you could fit Yosemite, you could fit all of the great national parks that we have in America inside the Adirondack Preserve. Beautiful. And so the more I come through here, the more convinced I am that I want to be able to do some of these broadcasts from these locations. Well, there's 6 million acres, so I'll run out of life before I run out of places to have nice backgrounds. So anyway, unfortunately, I'll have to do this teaching here from my car, and you won't be any worse for it because the content will still be the same, obviously. It's just that the scenery won't be as pleasant. Unfortunately, you can't get to see what I'm seeing driving down here back home. Okay, so yesterday and this week, today's Wednesday, I've been talking to you about contemplation. I've been talking to you about meditation in the Bible, biblical meditation. Contemplation. Yesterday I was just talking a little bit about solitude, and it was very interesting to note one of the comments from a young man. He happens to attend our church, and it was a really great it was a good question, where he was stating how solitude doesn't appeal to him because he's had so much of it during his life. And I made the remark that there's a difference between solitude and isolation. And that brought me to the subject matter of isolation. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. The difference between finding solitude and feeling isolated. All right, so first of all, there's many, how should I say it? There are many drawbacks to having nervous symptoms, to having anxiety and depression. And then when we go over to mental health disorders, where people are hospitalized, institutionalized, that type of thing, this feeling of isolation is worse by degrees. Now here's the odd thing. Yesterday I was talking about solitude, meaning the getting away from the rush, the getting away from the hectic life that so many of us lead, and just getting into nature. But as this young man brought forth the point, the feeling of isolation for him means that he's not looking for much more time by a brook or a river or whatever. And I thought that this again was just a great way to segue into a very important topic. Isolation. Different than solitude, but it is a very common, I'll say a side effect. It's a very common malady, is a better word, for those suffering with anxiety, depression, mental health disorders. This feeling of isolation. Now here's the odd thing. When you are in a place of solitude, you know that you are alone. Well, that's the purpose of solitude, is to get alone, be alone. Isolation, on the other hand, well, you could actually be alone and after a while feel like you're isolated, and indeed you may be isolated. But when it comes to these ongoing issues with anxiety and depression, you can be in a large crowd of people. You can be with people who are close to you, meaning family members, loved ones, friends, and so on, and still feel isolated. Now, this is due to the very nature of anxiety, depression, mental health disorders. It has a way of bringing you into a place where you are feeling isolated. I'm reluctant to say that you are isolated. However, there is a part of the real isolation. I'm not really sure if I've spoken about this before on these broadcasts or not, so I'm going to address it now. The feeling that, you could be with, gets very, I'll say interesting. You can be not only with family and friends and loved ones and whoever and feel isolated, but you could actually be with people who are suffering from the same things you're suffering with, and still each one, let's say for instance you were in the day room of a psychiatric facility, and each person in that room can still, and often do, still feel isolated. Now this is a remarkable, however sad, condition, or I said before side effect. It's not the proper word, but you get the idea. It's just it's a symptom. It's just one of these things that goes along with this malady of anxiety, depression, mental health disorders. And keep in mind that all of these vary by degrees. And for example, if you're talking about I have panic attacks and another person is talking about acute schizophrenia, you're on not only two different planets, you're on two different solar systems. So everything is kind of relative. People with moderate amounts of anxiety, here a little, there a little, won't feel the isolation that someone who has been suffering, as I mentioned about a woman in our class who had 30 plus years of schizophrenia. Well, she suffered much more feeling of isolation than someone with momentary moments of anxiety and moments of depression. So it varies by degrees, and therefore isolation will also vary by degrees. It's going to depend on the acuteness of how much you suffer from anxiety and depression. Now the question is, what actually can be done about it? See, this is where the difficulty comes in. I recommended to this young man that he read through Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt's speech made in 1899 called The Strenuous Life. And I would advise all of you to read it, The Strenuous Life, where he is advocating a life that doesn't shun away from hardship. So that's the basic gist of it. And it has, I think it has a lot to speak to our generation. Well, I say our generation, but I mean people that are living today, and especially younger people, where we have lived a life of such comfort and such ease and many luxuries that we are not aware of the type of hardships that many generations, or I should say all generations, passed through in and up to about the middle of the 20th century. Now, obviously, if you're suffering from anxiety and depression, you're saying, well, I've not had it easy. But that's not really what I'm referring to. As a matter of fact, a lot of these things that we are suffering from, anxieties and depressions and so forth, are coming from the fact that we are no longer the type of people that are used to encountering hardship and overcoming it. Again, I would recommend to all of you that you read through Theodore Roosevelt's speech she gave in Chicago, 1899, on the strenuous life. We have come into a generation and a period of time with technology and many things that has made our life easier. And you would probably say to me, well, again, my life hasn't been easy. Well, I'm going to say that because of the comforts, the luxuries, and all the leisure time that we have, other generations didn't have as much leisure time as we do. We have these issues that you're dealing with today: anxiety and depression. Let me give you another example. If we were back, well, let's go back 200 years ago. Go back even further if you want. All cultures were agrarian cultures. That means you have to spend time on your farm. That means the only thing occupying your mind, well, you know, the chief thing occupying your mind is making sure the livestock are fed and well kept, making sure the crops are not only planted, but making sure that you're going to grow a harvest, because if that harvest doesn't grow, well, you're not going to eat. So this, how do I say it, this focus on the necessities, and understand the difference between necessities and luxuries. The focus on necessities, that you have to grow crops, you have to plow 30, 40, 50 acres in order to plant crops, you have livestock to take care of, you need heat, you need wood for cooking, you got to chop firewood, you got to build your home, right? We're going back 200-300 years. The average person builds their own home. So think of life then and think of life now. Now, they had certainly more things to be concerned about than we do, such as diseases that modern medical science has pretty much put an end to. But they were too occupied with making sure they were living day to day to be able to not have anything else to worry about. We're on the other end of the spectrum. Anxiety, this rain's really coming down hard. I don't know if it's coming through, but it's coming down hard. This is what I hit earlier on. Anyway, when your mind is focused on one thing, survival, you don't have time to sit around and think about what's going to happen if my girlfriend doesn't like me. And don't think that I'm diminishing your problems. I'm just trying to give you some perspective so that we can get freedom from these symptoms and these maladies that we deal with today. You don't have time to think about what people are going to think about you if you're making your speech. All right, that's the number one anxiety for people. Number one fear is public speaking. You don't have time to think about that if you had to give some talk at your local church. Because you got to think about your crops and your children. Maybe one's got rheumatic fever, typhoid, or something. And you have a lot on your mind, so you're focused on that. that means you don't have time to be thinking about anything else. Secondly, with the introduction of all these conveniences, our life has become more complicated, even though the average individual 2, 3, 4, 500 years ago, keep on going back, has got something very large to think about, like food and water, heat, and other things, the elements, natural elements. They were not concerned about the things we are concerned about today. So in other words, they experienced much less anxiety as we know it than we're experiencing now. Let's go back to the pioneering of America. Well, of course, we know about the wars that took place between Native Americans and settlers, colonists. Certainly that was something to be concerned about, right? But yet there was just too much pressure to deal with, again, just life in general, eating. How far would a doctor be away from you? You didn't have a telephone. There was no television. No real way to communicate except to get in your buggy or get on your horse or walk if you had to the nearest neighbor and try to get a hold of the local doctor who could be 25, 30 miles away. And believe me, I just drove 30 miles. Actually, I drove more than 30 miles. It's a long way if you have to make it by buggy or by horseback. You kind of get the drift. The isolation that we're experiencing coming from anxiety is largely based on the period of time that we're living in now. And this is very problematic. So I guess with that there, and I'm hoping that you're really catching the idea of gaining perspective of life, what it was like hundreds of years ago in almost every culture, going back to the Garden of Eden, and what it's like now. We have actually created more problems. And life is not simple. It's not only complex. You can be complex and it's simple. It's complicated. And this is causing the nervous system to be overburdened all the time, or quite frequently. We're worried about money. We're worried about our retirement account. We're worried about the stock market. We're worried about will this girl like me? Will she marry me? Will this guy like me? Will he marry me? We go on and on and on. These were not concerns of the average person living throughout history, because they had more, actually they had less on their mind. They just had to survive. And that was life. And by the way, if you were raised in that time period from a child, you learned that life is hard. And that's why I'm recommending to you The Strenuous Life, the essay. Well, it's not an essay, it's a speech from Theodore Roosevelt. Life was hard. You didn't even have to talk about it. You didn't have to learn that in school. Life was hard. We, on the other hand, have been used to a life of ease, of quick relief from suffering, and it doesn't do well on this topic of anxiety and depression. It fosters it, in other words. Okay, let me deal with isolation and see if I can give you some help. Isolation, the feeling of isolation, and the best way to overcome that, now as Christians we have fellowship. And what you want to do is to be able to communicate. This is a very key element in the New Testament. Fellowship with other Christians. Just being around people. Being able to talk. You don't have to talk about your problems even. Just being able to talk and communicate and have friends is a big, big help. If for nothing else, for a few moments to get your mind off of your problems with anxiety and depression. You'll also find, as I did today, just taking this drive to a point of destination that I never arrived. Well, I arrived at it, but it was raining when I got there. Did me some good to be. It's been sunny, then it rains, and being in the woods and driving through the wilderness, which is what the Adirondacks is. Driving through the wilderness, just getting out of the house, does me some good, because my life is spent in prayer and in books, and dealing with people's problems, text messaging, emails, and so forth. That's a big burden. on the nervous system. So let me see if I can finish this again on isolation, fellowship. You're a Christian. Find other Christians that you can talk to. I've advised you in other broadcasts to, if you have someone you could really trust and talk about your feelings, that's a good thing. However, what does not help is to keep talking about it all the time to everybody you meet. It's not good for you. It's not good for them. It's a lose-lose situation. The key to overcoming, and this is something very big, the key to overcoming the feeling of isolation, and this is something we have to deal with at length in another broadcast, or it's going to take more than one broadcast, is what is known as the stigma of mental health issues. Now, again, if you have low-level anxiety and moderate depression, well, we're probably not going to classify that as mental health issue. When it's chronic, and it's been lasting for some months, some years, it's classified as a mental health issue. Now, we have a problem with that because now we don't want people to know that. And I know that I've said this at least once. Imagine being in the 21st century with everything being out in the open. You have people who are undergoing depression, anxiety, and so on, can't talk about it. Well, they feel they can talk about it. They feel they can't talk about it because they'll be put down, they'll be shunned. And I have to tell you, that problem does exist. So it's a risk that you're going to have to take so you can free yourself from the isolation. And then when you start doing that, once again, we're taking these small steps forward in overcoming anxiety, depression, and mental health disorders. All right, that was just a little bit of a thought that came out of a response I got from yesterday's broadcast. It was very, very good in respect that solitude is not for everybody, and especially if you've been feeling isolated. And one last thing about solitude, there are people who are, it actually scares them to be alone in the woods, to be alone at a river. I know you may find that pretty odd, maybe, but we have to respect the fact that some people have an anxiety about being alone. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all human. We all have issues. Don't you believe there's somebody out there that doesn't have an issue with something? So let me pray for you. Father God, I just ask today that you would help those who are watching this broadcast to overcome the feeling of isolation by being able to communicate their feelings to someone they trust. I also ask you, God, to help them to begin to understand the tremendous problem we still have in the 20th century with the stigma of mental health problems, when they shouldn't be, and we shouldn't be at that point any longer in this stage of life. In any case, it exists. I'm asking you to help and comfort all that are watching today, and I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so sorry about the field trip, but there'll be more. Remember to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button if you're actually interested in taking these lessons. Remember, they're going to come in small installments. There's no way you could deal with this subject in little audio bites. Can't do it. All right, so subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification button if you haven't already. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. And keep trusting God and keep casting your care upon Him. Read The Strenuous Life by Theodore Roosevelt. And hopefully we as Americans can embrace it once again and not be fearful of adversity or the hardships that are just simply a part of life. As always, I hope this is helping you. And if you do have a question, by the way, I've said this before, put it down in the comments, something you'd like me to address on the subject of anxiety, depression, mental health, and so forth. And I will do my best to address it here on God's Answers for Anxiety and Depression. All right. See you tomorrow. God bless.